We're going to return to one of our top stories this hour.
The US election is under cyber attack.
Cybercrime is booming.
Small businesses, hospitals, municipalities that are being shut
the
down.
companies attacked paid the ransom.
$64 million.
And joining us now for CrowdStrike.
The security firm CrowdStrike.
To bring these bad actors down.
To be actively going out, looking for threats in your environment, remediating them.
Hello, and welcome to Fal.Con 2021. My name is Marianne Budnick, and as the Chief Marketing Officer of CrowdStrike, I'm honored to kick off the show. We have 3 fabulous days planned for you, with executive keynotes, a look into exciting new product innovations, and an exclusive interview with Toto Wolff, the CEO of the Mercedes-AMG Petronas F1 racing team. We also have over 70 different learning sessions and workshops in multiple languages, covering 6 different tracks that dive deep into the latest in security technology. Our theme this year is the power of we, and I'd like to personally thank our customers, partners, and security practitioners across the globe who collectively work to protect our businesses, communities, and our way of life. On behalf of the entire CrowdStrike team, we're proud to have you on our side. We're grateful that you're joining us and hope you enjoy Fal.Con. With that, let me introduce the co-founder and CEO of CrowdStrike, George Kurtz. Take it away, George.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fal.Con 2021. I'm incredibly excited to welcome our customers back to what has been one of the industry's seminal events. We have a lot of exciting innovation and new products to show you, along with deep insights and learnings from the world's leading experts in cybersecurity. So whether this is your first Fal.Con or your 5th, we hope you come away energized, informed, and better prepared than ever to take on our adversaries and stop breaches. Now, over the past year, there has been a series of high-profile attacks, each of which would, on its own, be considered a watershed moment in cybersecurity. SUNBURST demonstrated the power of supply chain attacks and the vulnerability of our interconnected systems. The attack on a major U.S. pipeline showed the vulnerability of private infrastructure and provided a glimpse of how cyber attacks could cause widespread panic and mass disruption to our way of life. The attack on a critical food supplier threatened the world's food supply and forced the U.S. government to take a hard line with Russia over e-crime syndicates operating with impunity within its borders. An attack on a single managed service offering demonstrated the inevitable marriage of supply chain attacks and big game hunting, this time holding thousands of IT providers and SMBs hostage. While these infamous attacks dominated the headlines, forced governments to take action, and created many sleepless nights for CISOs, cybersecurity teams, and IT professionals, they represent just the tip of the iceberg. Over the last year, we've seen a 60% increase in attempted intrusions worldwide. So for every breach that makes the global news cycle, there are thousands more that go unreported in the media. The adversaries continue to learn and evolve their tactics and techniques more rapidly than ever before. And as part of this evolution, we saw nation states step out of the shadows to publicly attack private industries. E-crime actors have become more sophisticated, building ransomware as a service platforms to lower the barrier of entry and creating new underworld business models. We continue to see an increase in attacks that are not utilizing malware at all, but sophisticated attackers that are living off the land, weaponizing tools that are broadly available within the operating system or as generally accepted applications inside an enterprise. All in all, it's created a critical inflection point for our industry, our profession, our society, and our way of life. From the beginning, CrowdStrike has been on a mission to stop these breaches. And from the beginning, we've believed by creating a community, we would be stronger and smarter. First of all, we have our customers. As of today, we have over 13,000 customers making up one of the world's largest sensor networks. Collectively, we form one of the world's largest cybersecurity defense communities. Next, we have our partners. With them, we extend our broad reach globally as we secure the businesses of our shared customers. And finally, there are cybersecurity practitioners, all of you working tirelessly to protect organizations from the adversary and continuing to drive thought leadership and innovation across our industry. So we are all working together, customers, partners, and practitioners across the security community. This is the power of we. From the very beginning of CrowdStrike, we didn't set out to just build a single point solution to prevent malware on the endpoints. We had a much greater vision of the cloud-native platform that we needed to create in order to stop breaches. We started with a lightweight agent that collects data from a growing list of endpoints and workloads and streams that telemetry to our security cloud in real time. Our agent provides industry-leading prevention using multiple AI models that run locally as well as in the cloud, and that can accurately predict and prevent threats in less than 100 milliseconds. Network data visibility, deep visibility into directory services, identity, and user information, asset and configuration information, runtime protection for physical, virtual, and cloud assets, and behavioral IOAs that stop entire classes of attacks. This all feeds into the CrowdStrike threat graph to provide industry-leading detection and lightning-fast response. And it all powers modules that provide our customers value across their businesses, including protecting endpoints across operating systems and devices, from cloud workloads to IoT and mobile with the same lightweight agent. Protecting users and identities with the technology we acquired through our Preempt acquisition. Protecting you from malware or from ransomware. Our world-class EDR product provides the most granular visibility with the largest number of event types in the industry to stop the most sophisticated attackers and insidious threats. We're proud of what we built and how it protects our community from the most dire security threats we face today. But given that our adversaries don't rest, neither can we. We became the industry leader by focusing on the needs of our customers, which we'll continue to do to solve the biggest challenges you face. One of the issues that I constantly hear from our customers is that many of you have struggled with the unfulfilled promise of legacy SIEM and log management tools. SIEM has proven incapable of delivering better security and real-time threat detection. Security teams are inundated with data and alerts from multiple technologies, but still cannot gain an enterprise-wide view of how security incidents can cascade across their infrastructure. As a result, despite massive investments in time, personal capital, SIEM has evolved into a very expensive, difficult-to-use compliance tool. While compliance is critical, it doesn't equate to security and simply does not stop breaches from happening. This is part of why we recently acquired Humio, to provide our customers with the log management and observability they need. Humio provides the most important capabilities you need from a traditional SIEM without any of the shortcomings. Legacy SIEM simply cannot scale to meet the needs of today's organizations. It's difficult to integrate different data sources, and they require overly complex implementation processes to gain value. Few customers have the time or staff required to gain incremental value. Humio changes all of that and more. Humio is infinitely scalable for even the largest of enterprises. Its index-free search and market-leading data compression means that you can retain more data at a dramatically lower cost than any current solution on the market. Blazing fast search capabilities allow you to search in real time for any data across any data source, whether it's structured or unstructured, almost instantly, even at scale. Whether to solve compliance needs or to answer security questions, Humio is the ideal solution that is unmatched in speed, performance, and storage abilities. Humio truly allows you to log everything and answer anything in real time across your entire technology stack. This is why we'll continue to develop and invest in Humio's log management and observability offerings, and why we're excited to announce a new way for our customers to try Humio for themselves. I want everyone to experience the power of Humio. So today, I'm happy to announce that we are launching a new Humio Community Edition so that everyone can experience the power of Humio, available to you at no cost. That means free. The Humio Community Edition also offers users a sample data bench, which includes a sample of Fal.Con Data Replicator to get the sense of the value you experience from using Humio and Fal.Con together. I encourage you all to try it out and experience the power of Humio for yourselves. You can access the Humio Community Edition at The Nest, which you can find at humio.com. You can also hear more about the Humio Community Edition at one of the many learning sessions following the keynote presentations. Humio's capabilities are amazing on their own. Its foundational technology opens up the door to even bigger opportunities for us. To combine enterprise-wide telemetry with the intelligence of our threat graph to provide true enterprise-wide threat detection, investigation, response, and hunting across the entire enterprise security stack. And one of those opportunities is XDR. But before we jump into that, let's start with a brief history lesson. When we started our journey as CrowdStrike back in 2011, our mission was the same as it is now, to stop breaches. We had a grand vision for the platform that was required for the future needs of cybersecurity. We started by constantly streaming telemetry from the endpoint to the world's largest dedicated security cloud, where our AI provides constant protection from the most sophisticated of attackers and the most insidious of threats. It wasn't until 2013 when it was broadly accepted by the market as endpoint detection and response, or EDR. EDR, by its very nature, is focused on detecting and investigating suspicious activities or events on an endpoint and responding immediately to stop potential intrusions before they can turn into a costly and damaging breach. The endpoint itself evolved since that time. First, it was just traditional desktops, laptops, and servers. Then virtualized endpoints and servers, cloud workloads, mobile, and IoT. Meanwhile, many in the industry have started hand-waving with XDR announcements. SIEM vendors are rebranding old products as XDR as an effort to stay relevant. Legacy endpoint players are repackaging their failing point products as XDR to hide their inherent weaknesses. So-called next-gen endpoint players are simply rebranding their EDR as XDR. Firewall network vendors are jumping on the bandwagon, claiming XDR capabilities as a way to further lock in customers with technology that doesn't work. Even the analysts are far from aligned on a common definition. Ask 5 different people, and you'll get 5 different definitions for XDR. So the question is, what can we do to truly go beyond the endpoint? What does XDR truly mean? Let's define it. At the most basic level, XDR gives security teams an easier way to stop breaches by extending visibility, detection, and response actions beyond the endpoint. XDR must start with EDR technology and build upon that foundation. XDR is an extension of EDR. It enriches EDR data with telemetry from targeted vendor-specific security data, provides real-time threat detection, alerting, prevention, and hunting across multiple technologies and domains. It proactively automates responses. With this simple definition in hand, we are excited to announce our newest module, Fal.Con XDR. It extends beyond our industry-leading EDR to include data from other security and technology vendors. It leverages the industry's leading threat detection capability to extend beyond the endpoint and provides automated response that goes beyond anything else in the industry. Let me explain in more detail. I mentioned earlier why I was so excited about our Humio technology and the disruption it will drive in the log management and observability markets. Additionally, for us, Humio is a foundational architectural component that enables the X in XDR. X stands for extended, and really all that means is data or telemetry that comes from somewhere other than the endpoint. In order to drive better security outcomes for you, our customers, security teams require more telemetry from sources other than just the endpoint. That has created a big data problem that many of you may have experienced. Not to mention additional noise in the system in the form of false positives, alert fatigue, and extreme growth in cost for data processing and storage. By integrating Humio's technology into our core platform, it changes all of that. We can now stream and ingest third-party data in real time at an unprecedented scale without any friction. We can now store that data at a cost that is a fraction of what conventional solutions charge. And we can do all of that with index-free search of both structured and unstructured data from any data source. This extended telemetry will be automatically ingested into CrowdStrike's platform. The concept of detection is one of the most foundational components that enables our mission of stopping breaches. We have the world's best EDR solution today. We did the really hard work early on as a company in building EDR at scale, which gives us the strongest foundation from which to build XDR. That foundation allows us to stream telemetry from millions of endpoints and workloads globally. That foundational work enables us to process over 1 trillion security events per day in the world's largest dedicated security cloud, where our AI uses behavioral IOAs and multiple ML models to prevent not just garden variety malware, but to stop the most sophisticated of attackers and novel threats in order to stop breaches. Now, we are providing additional context to extend the outcomes of detections beyond the endpoint. So now that you've extended detection capability beyond just the endpoint, how do you respond? As I talk to customers all the time, one of the areas where they still seem to have challenges within their security organization is in how they respond to threats. Every security and IT pro I talk to wants fast, easy, and automated. Automation built into their security platform to improve their speed and efficiency. They want custom workflows that cater to their internal processes. Well, I'm excited to introduce a new capability for our customers that's baked right into the platform and is available for free. Fusion is a unified and extendable SOAR framework purpose-built on the CrowdStrike Fal.Con platform to orchestrate and automate any security workflow. Fusion leverages the power of the security cloud and relevant contextual insights across endpoints, identities, and workloads, reducing the response time, including incident containment and automatic remediation, is one of the most effective ways to control the impact of security incidents. Fusion helps improve SOC and IT efficiency and agility while meeting use case requirements. And most importantly, it drives better outcomes for our customers. And the best part of it all is that Fal.Con Fusion is free. And true to the vision of XDR, it can leverage telemetry from partner applications to ensure effective workflow automation. So in short, Fal.Con XDR offers expanded reach and deeper insights across the whole security stack, better detection of threats, faster investigation, nuanced understanding of the adversary tactics and techniques, and more efficient incident management. We are excited about adding Fusion and Fal.Con XDR to the platform. But as we said before, this conference and CrowdStrike as a whole is about the power of we. The power of we will also power XDR. Our customers, partners, and security practitioners are all part of this. For years, CrowdStrike has provided high-quality EDR data from endpoints, including network telemetry from those endpoints. As we've added more Fal.Con modules over time, this data set has expanded to include mobile, identity, and cloud telemetry. The combination of these, Threat Graph, real-time response, and Fusion, provides formidable extended detection and response through a single agent and managed through a single pane of glass. But to extend our world-class telemetry, we're proud to announce the CrowdStrike XDR Alliance, a unified and open extended detection and response initiative formed with security and IT operations, industry leaders, and best-of-breed SaaS platforms and other security solutions. We want to integrate with these technologies that perform detection at the edge of their domains. This is a critical ingredient for prevention. Native XDR, comprised of just one single vendor's technology, is simply not good enough. The Crowd XDR Alliance will offer first-of-its-kind integrated solutions for joint customers to protect their organizations from sophisticated cyber adversaries in a rapidly evolving threat landscape. Through this alliance, our founding partners will establish a shared schema for data exchange that will move XDR beyond just another buzzword. Organizations don't need more security alerts. They need the most relevant insights across their security stack to stop complex attacks and prevent breaches. Through this alliance, customers will be able to enrich EDR data with the most contextual telemetry from their existing security solutions to extend comprehensive visibility, protection, and control across all environments. This alliance will consist of leaders in network, email, cloud infrastructure, CASB, SaaS, and IT operations. Humio Community Edition, Falcon Fusion, Falcon XDR. These are just a taste of what we have in store throughout this conference. You'll hear from CrowdStrike experts and leading luminaries delivering more than 70 workshops and learning sessions. You'll have the chance to connect and collaborate with each other through our interactive platform, and you can get started now and try many of these new innovations free at CrowdStrike.com. That's the power of we. We stop breaches. Now I'd like to turn it over to our Chief Technology Officer, Mike Sentonas. Mike is going to take you through more detail on everything I've teed up here in our expansive security cloud strategy, including the importance of zero trust and identity that can only be delivered by the CrowdStrike Falcon platform. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, George. Welcome, everyone, to Fal.Con 2021. I appreciate every one of you connecting into this session, and I hope that you are all safe. Every week, I get asked how to deal with the latest security issues. I present to boards on how they should ensure their organization is managing risk. And I get asked, how do we stop breaches? What makes CrowdStrike so unique? My answer is always the same. We focus on the fundamentals, and you should too. You can't cut corners and expect to win. This is a basic concept that we're taught in school, when we play sports, and in business. Michael Jordan, widely regarded as one of the most successful athletes of all time, expressed the idea perfectly when he said, the minute you get away from fundamentals, whether it's proper technique, work ethic, or mental preparation, the bottom can fall out of your game, out of your schoolwork, your job, or whatever you're doing. And it's tempting to skip some steps, to shortcut the process. But doing so does not save time, and it does not sustainably get you closer to success. Consider the environment that we're all facing today. Organizations of all sizes from all segments are facing a threat landscape that continues to become more and more challenging. Think back over the last year of evolving ransomware, supply chain attacks, and an incredible number of vulnerabilities and active campaigns we've all needed to respond to. In response, the security tech stack that most organizations have been using has grown and become increasingly complex. It's common today to still see organizations that have 30 plus security products, yet they still get breached. Most people are still largely working remote, and for many organizations, this has become a norm. And at the same time, adversaries keep innovating. Nation-state actors are launching incredibly sophisticated attacks, and e-crime actors have tradecraft that at this point is only a few years behind. And while most organizations and many in the industry debate the best way to detect and prevent malware, the reality is many, if not most intrusions that we look at today don't use any malware at all. They look like normal access, like normal tools, and like normal user behavior. So you might stop the encryption process used by a ransomware adversary. You may restore from a backup and get up and running as quickly as possible, But if that adversary was on your network, if they broke in 2 months ago and they stole all of your data, and then they look to sell it and ask you for a ransom anyway, what then? But here's the good news. While today's landscape presents new challenges, the mission we share with customers, partners, and the industry as a whole is the same as it has been since CrowdStrike was first founded 10 years ago. And that mission is to stop breaches. The key to doing so is to stick to the fundamentals. In cybersecurity, we all hear exotic claims about what emerging technologies can do. There is more fragmentation in this market today than there has been for years. There are a lot of buzzwords, there's hype trends, and we need to focus on a very clear outcome. And that outcome is stopping breaches and keeping our organizations safe. But when I look at cybersecurity, it's a multifaceted domain, and that concept of fundamental just keeps coming back and resonating with me. You wouldn't build your house on sand, just like you wouldn't want to build your critical applications or IT tools on shaky security foundations. It's an important topic that needs to be addressed because I see it happen all too often. Everyone who works in the field understands the concept of technical debt. When you cut corners to save time today, you're borrowing against your future calendar. We have to resist the urge to take shortcuts that can result in taking unnecessary or ambiguous risks, which many of us in the security industry find or should find intolerable. We need to consider how flaws or weaknesses in legacy code bases used today, even within technology as central as the operating systems we all use today, are being actively exploited. And organizations that are service providers have a special obligation to understand how technical debt can compromise downstream customers and users' security. But if you solve today's issues well, that will set you up for success tomorrow. You can face the future from a position of strength if you are better prepared. And I believe nothing is more fundamental than having the right architecture for tomorrow built from day one. That's the solid ground upon which you build. At CrowdStrike, we designed the Fal.Con platform from day one to be cloud native, to use true microservices from the start. No lift and shift from an on-prem server or an on-prem version to a virtual server and then calling it cloud. That word cloud native gets thrown around way too loosely today. Let me make it clear. If you offer multiple versions of your product, if you offer an on-prem version and a cloud, you are not cloud native. So why did we build a cloud native platform and cloud only? Well, firstly, cloud is the only architecture that can handle the volume and the scale for comprehensive visibility that organizations need to secure themselves. We built a single agent that enables security, that does not impact end user experience. It doesn't create downtime for the business through reboots. Our sensor was designed with real-time streaming to the cloud, which means zero latency. It's designed with the ability to hunt offline, to be able to hunt retroactively, so the adversary is not alerted to hunting operations by noisy scanning and has no ability to tamper with or purge local data. And critically, there is no impact to business when conducting investigations. Our design was to leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning and to invent the concept of indicators of attack rather than relying on legacy signatures. Our design was to provide this capability delivered from the cloud and integrated right into the core of the agent. And threat hunting was designed as part of that core architecture. It's a critical component to solve non-malware attacks, and it's also the best and maybe the only defense against silent failure. And finally, our design was to integrate threat intelligence into the platform. So let's discuss artificial intelligence and machine learning a little bit more. The architecture that we've built uniquely enabled us to develop a sophisticated artificial intelligence program and deploy multiple models at scale. Whilst we were one of the early pioneers, a basic machine learning capability at this point is table stakes for next-gen vendors. The differentiation you have is determined by the scope and the quality of data, as well as the validation process and related safeguards. Successful application of machine learning to cybersecurity problems requires large amounts of input data, and we have that because of our cloud-native architecture. Today, CrowdStrike leverages over 1 trillion events per day to develop a comprehensive baseline understanding of conditions across our entire global user base. We have the best of two worlds. Machine learning models deployed on the sensor, trained on cloud data that can react at local speeds, as well as vastly more complex cloud models that look at large amounts of historic data to protect in real time. These work together to drive outcomes in production. And we also look to integrate inputs and human expertise into these models. We get those inputs from our malware researchers, from our intel team, from our elite threat hunters at Overwatch, our Fal.Con complete managed services team, and our incident response engagements team. Our machine learning models are designed to detect against new threats like SUNBURST and to do it proactively, and then turn these into new model iterations. This is a cycle that ensures that every model knows more than its predecessor, and we're continuing to innovate in this space. We are deploying more complex behavioral machine learning models in our cloud, which our agents will benefit from without any changes. We're bringing machine learning into more areas of the Fal.Con platform, for example with CrowdScore, the Fal.Con Sandbox Threat Score, and the upcoming Spotlight Vulnerability Prioritization Score. We are working on more fundamental research, like solving critical issues with research against adversarial machine learning, where ML models are used to bypass other ML models. We understand the dynamics of scale better than anyone else in the industry. There are some tasks that humans will never be able to do as well as computers. This includes large-scale processing activities, but the inverse is also true, and human threat hunters make some fundamental contributions that simply cannot be performed by AI alone. This approach, having the best AI and ML in the industry combined with the best human threat hunters, is critical to combat the realities and the unpredictabilities of today's adversaries. We all know that AI is amazing at certain things. We know AI can beat humans in complex games like chess. We've seen that before. But chess has well-defined rules and outcomes. Think about cybersecurity and look at the parallels with autonomous driving. With autonomous driving, there are rules, but those rules are not strictly enforced. You can't guarantee that another driver isn't breaking the speed limit or making a turn that you don't expect. You can't guarantee the road that you go down is in pristine condition or somebody doesn't jump out across the front of your car. Those are complex problems to solve, and as we all know, AI alone is not yet up to the task of solving those problems. In the cybersphere, you are, at the end of the day, dealing with human adversaries. There's no autopilot in cybersecurity. AI can take the load off, but adversaries don't play by the rules, so you can't rely on AI alone. Humans plus AI are superior in cyber because adversaries are human and AI as well. One of the founding concepts that CrowdStrike embraced, and something that I'm really passionate about, is the importance of breaking down the actual tradecraft that adversaries use, using that information to educate organizations so they can better protect themselves. One of the early core insights is that adversaries are out there working day in, day out, training to breach organizations. And as I mentioned earlier, they're doing it increasingly without using malware. Our mission is to stop breaches, to focus on that critical outcome. As an industry, we need to move beyond naive debates about prevention versus detection, which one is better or worse. Of course, you need to stop malware proactively with high efficacy scores. We demonstrate that test after test. But here's the thing. 68% of the attempted intrusions that we analyzed in the last 3 months did not use any malware at all. So should you prevent malware proactively? Of course you should. Should you also use detection? Absolutely. Those two concepts are not in conflict. In fact, when correctly integrated, the two combine to deliver a superior outcome. We need to focus on the fundamentals, doing everything possible to prevent every adversary in every stage of the attack. That's non-negotiable. We instrument customer environments, their laptops, desktops, servers, mobiles, to find any indication of attack. And we use an array of automated means, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, to prevent malicious code execution. That's how you are successful. And we augment this with the very best threat hunting team in the business. They use hypothesis-driven hunting techniques. They use emerging security research and knowledge of the adversary targeting to look for adversaries proactively. At CrowdStrike, we believe that every second counts in cybersecurity, as it does in motorsports. And we believe in data-driven approaches to solving hard problems. When you think about e-crime adversaries, they're moving and increasing their speed in pursuit of their objectives. And CrowdStrike Overwatch observations show that e-crime adversaries are carrying out attacks with hands-on keyboard, attacks that don't use malware, and they're capable of moving laterally, sideways within a victim environment in an average of 1 hour and 32 minutes. They are fast, and they are getting absolutely faster. And that's why we advocate for something that we call the 1-10-60 rule, where we encourage defenders to identify a hands-on keyboard attempted intrusion within 1 minute, investigate it within 10, and isolate or remediate threats within 60 minutes. The rule is fundamentally a KPI for security teams. It's the type of rule that even a non-technical CEO or board member could appreciate. Practitioners may or may not meet it because of new adversary tradecraft or TTPs, but honest use of the rule prevents one from making excuses and should help clarify future requirements. Sometimes the fundamentals that I talk about are basic. They're nuts and bolts program management type tasks. Think back over the past year and how the security leaders and teams that you know fared. Even some of the most sophisticated, proficient folks we work with in the industry had some tense moments, some tough times, sorting through possible implications from third-party supply chain hacks, or more recently, the high-profile Microsoft Exchange campaign from back in March of this year. Incident response capacity across the entire industry was completely strained over the last 12 months. People who had planned ahead and had a retainer in place had backup on call. Those who didn't had to scramble. I believe it's never a great strategy to exchange business cards with an IR company when an incident is already underway. Security and risk management frameworks must include incident response, where the clear best practice for organizations would be to have a retainer in place. That creates a world of difference in terms of mitigating risk and ultimately in the quality of life during a trying period for a lot of security leaders. I talked about this earlier. One of the core fundamentals is our focus on threat actors. From day one, we've sought to develop the most comprehensive possible understanding of attackers, who they are, how they operate, and what motivates them. We never lost focus on this and have gone on to develop one of the most detailed and insightful bodies of research on those threat actors available anywhere. We have customers across the globe covering roughly every imaginable sector in the industry, so we see it all. In this domain, we achieve increasing returns to scale. With every passing quarter and every new incident response, we gain additional telemetry, additional insights on tradecraft, and a more fulsome understanding of the threat environment. Our insights not only drive the innovation in our platform, but also help our customers develop and maintain accurate threat models. And we see organizations adjusting risk mitigation practices or implementing new security controls based on new targeting information or trends that we provide them. I also think a lot about fundamentals in terms of our people, our teams, our most valuable assets. The skills shortage has been an issue for some time now, and this is not something that's going to go away post-COVID. We're hearing more and more every day about burnout amongst cybersecurity professionals across the industry. Most organizations today are impacted by the deficiencies of the cybersecurity workforce and the competitiveness of the job market. But you need to protect your organization and have constant vigilance 24/7, 365. And this is a challenge for even the largest of organizations. That's why we launched Fal.Con Complete, to provide the people, the process, and the technology required to handle all aspects of endpoint security, from onboarding and configuration to maintenance, to monitoring, incident handling, and remediation. And we do that 24/7, 365. What sets Fal.Con Complete apart is very simple. We made the decision early on that we would own the results. From day one, Fal.Con Complete has included our best-in-class breach prevention warranty, designed to provide confidence to our customers that CrowdStrike stands strongly behind our team and the results that they deliver. I'm proud to say that in more than 3 years since we launched Fal.Con Complete, we have not had a single claim against this warranty. At CrowdStrike, throughout our 10-year history, We focused on the fundamentals and building the platform the right way. Once you have the fundamentals down, you build on them, and then you keep moving forward. A central design principle of the platform is the ability to evolve and face new threats, to meet new requirements. It doesn't matter what security challenge you are trying to solve or how, it will involve these fundamentals that I've talked about. And our strong focus on fundamentals has allowed us to evolve from the core Fal.Con EDR capabilities of yesterday to solve some of the toughest security challenges that our customers face today. We innovated with agentless asset discovery, cybersecurity hygiene. We added scanless vulnerability management through to more recently forensics, cloud security posture management, and workflow and remediation that we extend through our CrowdStrike store and partner ecosystems. An organization that may start with prevention only or may start with EDR uses the same architecture, the same single agent to then add cybersecurity hygiene, to add vulnerability management, to expand into the cloud and beyond. And they do that with no reboot required and no downtime. We have an architectural goal to collect data once and use that data multiple times. We also focus on manage once and reuse to reduce complexity. This approach we have taken allows us to extend the Fal.Con platform, to cover new and emerging workloads, to add new modules, to enrich our platform, to add new data sources, and to solve the challenges that our customers are facing without complexity. This same philosophy, a focus on fundamentals, doing the hard work up front so you don't have to, not cutting corners, and building a foundation that will grow with our customers and keep them one step ahead of emerging threats, is how we've prioritized our long-term vision. And you can see that vision when George talked about XDR, our groundbreaking work on automation and stream processing. While some in the industry are simply glomming on to the acronym for marketing and valuation purposes, I want to be clear. XDR is not the evolution of SIEM. XDR is not putting security events into one location. XDR is the enrichment of EDR data to allow faster response to threats wherever they occur, on-premise, in the cloud, or any device. With XDR, we are extending and expanding on the value proposition offered within our core Fal.Con platform, but the ultimate goal remains the same, to bring you the right visibility at the right time to make the best decision possible and to take the right action to stop breaches. Our XDR strategy is to build upon our industry-leading EDR and enrich our threat graph data with context from other solutions, other vendors, covering security, and when the opportunity arises, possibly non-security use cases. Data from the endpoint continues to offer the most high-fidelity, high-value information from the organization and gives us the foundation, the framework to deliver deep, meaningful context and outcomes to our customers. The work that we have been doing for 10 years sets us up for success to solve the challenges that XDR will bring. We understand that data is about value and not volume. Yet at the same time, we've proven that we can scale our data infrastructure and scale our customers with millions of workloads under management to ingest more than 1 trillion unique signals per day to drive superior outcomes. When we started CrowdStrike, we spent time establishing an ontology. We spent time defining the relationships between the telemetry from our sensor and the threat activity. And this has helped us. It helped us in how we do prevention. It allowed us to create the concept of an indicator of attack, and it benefits in threat hunting. XDR requires the same concepts to be applied on telemetry from multiple sources. By bringing data in the right way and by using the right technology and architecture, we can provide rapid, valuable insight and improved security while reducing the burden on security analysts and extending the value you get from your other security products. Without doing all of this hard work, all you have is log collection. And our platform has always been sophisticated enough to offer power users the ability to ask meaningful questions against our first-party data set, yet flexible enough to provide insight and protection for those that want a more turnkey offering. With Fal.Con XDR, you'll have that same flexibility. We want to grow with you, and we believe that our XDR enables this as much in the same way as our core Fal.Con solution. By doing this schema work with ontology, we can extend machine learning, we can extend our indicators of attack and crowd score, We can extend threat hunting and response. All the things that have made Fal.Con the gold standard for modern endpoint protection and to extend third-party data sources. If Fal.Con represents the synthesis of speed, insight, and value across workload-centric data, XDR represents the same core tenets across broader infrastructure. In fact, this aligns with Forrester, a leading analyst firm who defines XDR as the evolution of EDR, which optimizes threat detection, investigation, response, and hunting in real time. Forrester goes on to say in a recent blog, it is a cloud-native platform built on big data infrastructure to provide security teams with flexibility, scalability, and opportunities for automation. And I couldn't agree more. When our team was looking at building on our core fundamental components or how we can continue to use data from any source, we were so excited to bring Humio into CrowdStrike to build an extension to our very foundation that will help us across multiple fronts. To accelerate the work we were doing, our teams looked across the market. We looked at various technologies and various approaches. We looked at almost everything, and Humio was the standout, clear winner. We didn't just want a product that offered a commodity approach to an increasingly germane problem. We sought out a technology that rethought the problems and limitations associated with traditional data ingestion platforms. Humio's flexible modern data platform solves log management challenges for enterprises by enabling complete observability to answer any question, to explore threats and vulnerabilities, and gain valuable insights from all logs in real time. Instead of being limited by cost and speed, Humio enables customers to store all of their data and ask any relevant question, whether that data was ingested 10 seconds ago, 10 hours ago, 10 days ago, or even 10 months ago. We know many users are scared by cost overruns and scale limitations that are often an issue with other data ingestion platforms, and we think you'll find Humio to be a breath of fresh air. And Humio enables streaming ingestion of tens of hundreds of terabytes at scale at an industry-leading total cost of ownership. With easy deployments at any scale, hybrid options to deliver the autonomy to choose where customers want ingested data to reside, and out of the box, the solution maximizes user flexibility to enable the identification of incidents across the enterprise infrastructure and supports a variety of SecOps and ITOps use cases. I'm so excited with the announcement of the Humio Community Edition today. We've completed multiple internal and external integrations. We're already offering integrations with other SIEM technology, with various firewall, email, and NDR vendors. In fact, we have already integrated over 20 such integrations available today. Because Humio's engine is so fast and the language is so flexible, integrations with Humio are so much more powerful than any other log management solutions. And we've also been innovating with internal integrations, including with Fal.Con Data Replicator, and we delivered an IOC package which comes standard with every Humio license. If you're not ready to replace your existing logging platform yet, we want to help you, and we want to help you augment your solution with Humio to enable you to have access to all of your data. We can also integrate with tools like Cribble to enhance that data pipeline and allow you to easily migrate your biggest sources of data through Humio immediately and start ingesting all of your logs, even running Humio side by side with existing solutions that you may be using. I was also excited about the capability that Humio technology will add to our XDR initiatives. Fal.Con XDR leverages this technology as a core component of Fal.Con's data platform. By integrating Humio's technology into our core platform residing within the CrowdStrike Security Cloud, it will act as a central hub or a repository for where customers can ingest XDR data once from any other security partner. And Humio enables this low-friction ingestion of third-party data without requiring a strict schema and mapping of all third-party data fields to that schema. You can choose to use Humio to power your data warehouse, or you can automatically leverage Humio as part of Fal.Con XDR to solve specific security use cases. The future we envision includes an integrated approach to XDR, extending the fundamental architecture and core attributes from the Fal.Con platform that many of you use today. But there are also structural changes afoot in the underlying infrastructures that comprise the modern enterprise. Most notably, this includes the rising salience of zero trust. We've talked a lot so far about the security of the workload, we've talked about data. The last piece is to talk about connecting the user to the workload that they are using. And identity is a fundamental piece of cybersecurity. It is critical to everything that we do. Increasingly, we need elegant solutions to connect a resource to a permitted user and to also deny access to unpermitted users. This is a key reason why we acquired Preempt. We've focused on bringing the Preempt technology into the Fal.Con platform, and we are announcing a number of new capabilities. These include the ability to manage all Fal.Con modules from the one management console, to provide broader visibility and control of unmanaged devices, the ability to build policies for endpoints that do not have a Fal.Con sensor for more control and security. This also provides user visibility on devices that do not have a Fal.Con sensor, but still allows for tracking user and service account activity. We're leveraging endpoint ZTA scores and using those ZTA scores in policies, realizing the zero trust goal of a deeper risk score of both the endpoint and the user. And importantly, we've been working on unifying account events to ensure that they're all integrated and it's possible to view them alongside other Fal.Con module events. I've talked a lot about building on the fundamentals of the platform. I'm so excited about the research projects that we've been working on, but there's so much more. There's so many other research areas that I've not yet talked about, like validating the integrity of operating system and application software files, using a verification method between the current file state and a known good baseline, working on solving how our customers can orchestrate and automate complex workflows to improve SOC efficiency, building policy and detection extensibility across the entire platform, enabling our partners to have their user interface in our user interface, and continuing to innovate in the CrowdStrike store to onboard more technology partners to further extend our marketplace of cyber security apps. Make sure you don't miss our Chief Product Officer, Amol Kulkarni, where he will dive into more detail in these products. From our earliest days, we've worked to break down the belief that best-in-class security has to be challenging to implement and maintain. And we've focused on the adversary, in the process integrating threat intelligence into everything that we do so you understand the threats that have or potentially will target your organization. 10 years on, that core belief and core focus is as true as it's ever been. And with our XDR solution, you'll get even more value out of your broader security investments while reducing the complexity to operate, which is core to our platform architecture. Our goal as a company has always been to provide you with the best possible security outcome. By focusing on the fundamentals, our core Fal.Con platform is the gold standard in workload protection, and Fal.Con allows you to easily leverage new modules that we continue to release to get even more value out of your CrowdStrike investment. We know that you put your trust in us every single day, and this is something that we never take for granted. Our promise is to continue delivering on the investment that you make in us. We'll continue innovating to keep you one step ahead of the continually evolving threat landscape and to help you stop breaches. Thank you.
皆様、Fal.Con 2021キーノートセッション第1部いかがだったでしょうか。ここからはですね、私、クラウドストライクの古川から日本語による解説セッションを行いたいというふうに思っております。今日様々な発表されましたけれども、主にですね、ジョージ・クルーツのキーノートの内容、これをですね、日本語で皆様にお伝えしていくセッションとなりますので、お付き合いくださいませ。それでは早速ですが、スタートさせていただきます。まず冒頭ですね、セキュリティにおける前例のない今の現状という形で様々なセキュリティの侵害、そして取り巻く状況といったものを説明させていただきました。サンバースト、そして、クリティカルインフラストラクチャーですね、石油のパイプラインが止まったとか様々な事件ございました。さらには食肉加工会社に対する攻撃というので、実際の生活、そしてフードサプライチェーンにわたるところの被害といったものが起きている。そして引き続きですね、e クライムですね、そしてサービスプロバイダーを狙ったもの、こういった取り巻く環境がですね、日々、悪化しているという現状があるというのを最初認識させていただきました。 国家ぐるみの攻撃のアクター、そして、犯罪集団といったアクターと、様々なケースはあるんですけれども、総じて、攻撃に対する手法であったり、テクニックといったものが巧妙化してきているというところになっています。では、それに対して、私どもが、クラウドストライクがどのような形で、それに対抗していくのかというお話を次にさせていただいているわけですけれども、クラウドストライクは設立当初から、やはりこの攻撃者の一歩先を行くという形で、セキュリティ侵害を防いでいく、そういった使命を帯びて、会社を設立し、そして、今日まで10年間、様々な技術を磨き、そして脅威インテリジェンスを磨き、そしてサービスを磨き、お客様を守るということを行ってきたという形になります。そして、さらにですね、重要なのが、先ほど我々多くのお客様、今1300にわたる大きな企業、組織のお客様に支えられておりますけれども、これらが集まることによって攻撃者を撃退していく。さらにはですね、このお客様だけではなくて、パートナーですね、そして業界団体といったところにもオープンにこのテクノロジーといったものを連携させていくことで、攻撃者からの侵害といったものを守っていくと、まさにその社名にありますように、クラウドですね、この集まる、そして戦うというのを具現化してきているというお話になります。そして、今後ですね、我々どういうふうな形で、この攻撃の激化に対して立ち向かっていくのかというところなんですけれども、やはりそういった先ほど言った様々なそのクラウド、今いろいろな集まりですね、に対して、そこにおけるデータの点と点を結びつけて、そして最適な解を導き出していくといったところを我々今後も継続してまいりますということになります。そしてそのキーとなるのがこのFal.Conのプラットフォームなんですけれども、そこにですね、新たにこのHumioというログ管理のソリューション、これを昨年買収いたしました。このHumioが今後ですね、今日様々な発表をさせていただきますが、その中で非常に大きな位置を占めてくるという形になっているんですね。でこれはログマネジメントというと、通常の CIEM ですね、CIEM と何が違うのかという話なんですけれども、現状 CIEM ツールといったものは多くの課題といったものがあります。導入されているお客様、またいろんなところでお話をお聞きになっているかもしれないんですが、やはりですね、CIEM、これが我々今様々な課題といったものを抱えているというふうに理解しておりますので、そういったものをすべて排除した次世代のデータログマネージドソリューションとして提供していく、そういう形で我々このHumioといったものを位置づけています。例えば、組織のニーズに対してフレキシブルにそのスケールを拡張するであったり、新たにどんどんセキュリティの機器であったり、ソリューションといったものを導入したときに、それらをデータプロセスをですね、素早く統合し、可視化をしていくというのも非常にテクニカルな問題で難しかったりですね、またそれを習熟するための手順であったり、そういったものが複雑であるとか、様々な問題がございます。こういったものをもう無限にスケーラブルに増強できるログマネジメントソリューションであり、そしてデータの圧縮量といったものもですね、独自のテクノロジーで非常に高く、さらにデータといったものの持ち方ですね、構造ですけれども、そういったものを問わず、すべてのデータをリアルタイムで検索できる。そういった次世代のログマネジメントソリューションとしてHumioは位置づけられています。 さらに、今私がお話ししただけではなかなか伝わりにくいと思いますので、フミオのコミュニティエディションという形でですね、フリーでトライアルをしていただけるような、そういう実際そのフミオを使ってのセキュリティのオペレーションといったものが実現、体感できるようなプログラムもご用意しておりますので、ご活用くださいということです。そして、このフミオが追加されたことに何が大きなインパクトがあるのかというとですね、これは次に参りますけれども、XDR ですね。XDR という言葉に関しては、この後の第2部でかなり細かく説明されるので、そちらお聞きいただければと思うんですけれども、より幅広く、そしてより素早く検知し、そして適切な対応を取っていくという形になるわけですけれども、これらのインフラストラクチャー、特にですね、この XDR の X の部分ですね、ここにこのエクステンディッドっていう X ですけれども、拡張する、それを担うのがこのフミオになります。で、XDR、当然我々EDRでエンドポイントから上がってくる状況は膨大です。それを中心に、その後ろのディテクション&レスポンスの戦略を立てていくというスタンスはこれまでも変わらないんですけれども、それ以外に様々な要素といったものを加えることでより精度を上げていく。これが極めて重要になってくるわけです。そこで私ども冒頭に申しましたパートナーシップ。そしてじゃあそこから上がってきたデータをどう総合的に、構造的に持って、それを瞬時に判断していくのかといったところが重要になってくるんですが、そこのログマネジメントにフミオを活用することで、この X の部分を非常に拡大していく。そして、この D ですね、複数のテクノロジーを加えてのディテクション、検知といった部分。これは我々すでに EDR、エンドポイントにおいては非常に強力なテクノロジーを持っておりますけれども、ここをさらに強化していく。そしてさらにですね、レスポンス。これもこの後申し上げますけれども、自動化ですね。キーノートセッションでも触れられてましたが、SOA というセキュリティオートメーションオーケストレーション&オートメーション。ここの自動化でレスポンスをやっていくと、こういったものにつながってくるわけです。これらをすべて私どものクラウドストライクのソリューションとして、プラットフォームが提供できるというのが非常に今回アナウンスの大きな鍵になってくるかなというふうに思っております。はい、でこれを私もですね、Fal.Con XDR という形で今日発表させていただいたという形ですね。はい、でこのディテクションのところ、ディテクション&レスポンスのところですね、そこにちょっと話が入っていくんですけれども、このレスポンスに関しても、やはりですね、我々先ほど申しました通り、Fal.Con Fusion という、これはSOA のオーケストレーション&オートメーションのソリューションでございますが、このフレームワークをですね、このFal.Conプラットフォームに標準で組み込んでいくということを進めております。で当然ですね、これはプラットフォームの一部の機能として提供されるので、追加のコストなくお使いいただけるという形になっているわけですけれども、この通常のインシデント対応といったものをいかに自動化していくのか。それが先ほど冒頭ですね、様々なインシデント起きました。それがどんどんですね、機能的にですね、攻撃の時間といったものが短くなってきている。それをですね、人間系だけではなくて、このSOAを最大限活用することで、効率的に実施していこうというのが私どもの考え方になっております。つまり、この XDR 構成するものですね、ログを収集する、エンドポイント以外のものから収集して、相関的に分析をしていくようなエンジンとしてのフミオ、そして、それらの検知を行うための仕組みとしての EDR の強化、そして、レスポンスとしての、SOA の機能ですね、Fal.Con Fusion といったもの。こういったものを合わせて、XDR、まさに、今激化してつつある攻撃といったものをですね、封じ込める方向性として、このようなものを提示させていただいたと いう形になるわけでございます。そしてこの XDR を支えるためにですね、我々単体ではやはりできません。やはりスコープがエクステンデッドしておりますので、このクラウド XDR アライアンスといったものも発表させていただきました。AWS さん、Z スケーラーさん、プルーフポイントさん、ネットスコープさん、オクタさんといったところ、そういったところをティア1としてですね、幅広くこういったパートナーを広げていく、そして強力なアライアンスを結んでいくことで、業界全体としてお客様を守っていくという体制を整えましたというのが本日のお話となります。それでは、続いての第2部といったものをご期待いただければというふうに思います。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Welcome back. We're so happy that you're joining us today. Fal.Con is a special time of year for us, where we bring our whole community together to learn, share, and grow to be stronger as an industry. Thank you for being here. Now we'll head to our Washington, D.C. office, where Shawn Henry, President of CrowdStrike Services and Chief Security Officer, will speak some more about you, our customers, and how we work together to stop breaches. Shawn, over to you.
I'm excited to be here during an important time in world history. We've been experiencing unparalleled growth in our global digital transformation, and the value of that technology makes our lives exponentially better and more interesting. Unfortunately, the very opportunities created by this expansion enable an environment exploited by criminal enterprises and foreign intelligence services, which poses significant risk to individuals, small and medium businesses, and multinational corporations alike. That's a recipe for catastrophic loss, and it's an untenable position for long-term economic growth, infrastructure development, and human prosperity. You've heard and will continue to hear a lot about the power of we, specifically about our technology, the expansion of the cloud, and where we're headed, both as a company and within the cybersecurity sector. But I'm excited to talk to you about something else. The power of we from a very different perspective. The power of we as it pertains to the people. Of course, that's us within CrowdStrike working internally across many different business units. But it's also about working collaboratively and supporting our clients and our partners, internally and externally, to ensure the resiliency of network ecosystems and to provide the expertise, experience, and ultimately the best service possible in the industry. And that's a necessity now more than ever. As we look at the ever-evolving threat landscape, it's important to acknowledge what's been happening in cyberspace over the past year and the impact it's having on our daily lives. The attacks we've seen since the close of 2020, things like SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, JBS, Kaseya, numerous Microsoft zero-day vulnerabilities, and the thousands of others that you've never heard of because they didn't make it to the media, threaten us substantially. Besides the obvious less safe, less secure, less private adages, the significant impact on business operations and critical infrastructure and the real effects on our physical world are startling. The adversaries aren't slowing down. They're actually increasing in cadence, sophistication, aggression, and most recently, in arrogance. In the past, we often saw these attacks occur under a perceived veil of secrecy. I've said before, when you can operate with anonymity, you can launch attacks with impunity. I'm going to change that a little bit now, because we know many cases who they are, and they don't care. They're operating with greater impunity, more brazenly, overtly than ever before, and without concern for penalty or sanctions. In law enforcement, we called it the smash and grab. They're coming in, breaking things, scorching the earth, taking what they want and disrupting entire industries in the process. And then essentially sitting back with a cocktail and their feet up on the desk, watching the devastation unfold. I find it astonishing. Given the current climate of the world, in 2020 alone, we saw over 100 identified ransomware attacks in the healthcare sector, and there were likely many more than that, all during a global pandemic. Who does that? Malicious and arrogant criminals who are out for themselves with reckless disregard for the rest of society. Just as viruses evolve in response to vaccines, the adversaries are taking note of where the money and the high-profile targets are. how companies are adapting and implementing security, and they are evolving their attack methodologies and their tactics in response to that. And those attacks are becoming ever more pernicious and ominous for us all. I've been in security for more than 30 years, and I've continuously faced adversity, conflict, and crisis. Kidnappings, violent gangs, terrorist assaults, electronic espionage, and disruptive and destructive cyber attacks. During these most challenging times, at the darkest and most perilous moments, I've always asked myself, who do I want with me in this fight? Because the stakes are too high and you can't go it alone. I've been very fortunate to have fought, both literally and figuratively, beside incredibly courageous women and men, and the outcomes we've shared are due to that concerted effort and steadfast resolve. That is the power of we. At CrowdStrike, we have a one team, one fight mentality, and one team, one fight has become an integral part of our corporate culture. We recognize that regardless of the business unit or any personal objectives, the needs of the customer and the broader company come first, and we can only meet those needs if we operate together in unison. We do the right thing for the right reason in a collaborative way, all in support of our mission, because the needs of the many outweigh the wants of the few. It's the very definition of synergy, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So how do we stem the tide? How do we get in front of all this? How do we differentiate ourselves? By harnessing the power of we. In this sense, we means our CrowdStrike team, our partners, our clients, and even the broader cybersecurity industry. If you've heard me speak before, I often talk about the three-legged stool of good cybersecurity and incident response. It involves full support and involvement, first, of course, with our customers, those who are entrusting us with their safety, security, and the protection of their greatest assets. Secondly, our partners, those who've signed up to fight the good fight with us. They're the ones filling the gaps specific to certain clients to ensure the victim's operations, customers, stakeholders, and brand all recover from an attack. Partners like AWS, EY, Zscaler, many law firms, and many more organizations. Finally, it's CrowdStrike, the company, and our employees who are our greatest assets. While we could certainly try to do it alone and be successful with just our technology, we do it so much better, so much stronger, so much faster, and so much more effectively when we incorporate the people, partners, and customers into the equation. Crisis management is a whole-of-company response, and we provide whole-of-team support. This collective is what makes CrowdStrike successful and why we continue to be seen as the leader in this space. And it's all of you here today that are critical in safeguarding not only your own organization, but the broader global infrastructure. And honestly, even working with our competitors is a factor here. Someone asked me the other day why I include the broader cybersecurity industry in this context, and they were surprised to learn that CrowdStrike has actually on occasion worked side by side in unison with our direct competitors to remediate a client environment after a major attack. We do it because it's the right thing to do, it's what's right for the customer, and it's what this is all about. I'd like to share a few examples of what I'm talking about here. We had a major university contact us when they became a victim of a ransomware attack by a well-known spider group. The attackers entered the environment via an open remote desktop configuration and began to leverage an exploit that allowed them to move laterally to more than 800 systems. Backdoor access was then obtained utilizing CrowdStrike, and they deployed ransomware to those systems they now had access to. Through collaboration of our intelligence analysts and the execution of our endpoint recovery systems teams, all in partnership with the victim organization, we were able to successfully pinpoint the origin of activity, trace the movement throughout the environment, and remediate the attack, getting operations back up and running with limited damage. That's the power of we. In another situation, our Overwatch team notified a large international power company when they saw fingers on the keyboard and indicators of an imminent ransomware deployment. They noticed the threat actor had VPN'd into the environment and conducted password spraying, eventually obtaining 9 credentials, 7 of which had privileged access. the adversary deployed CrowdStrike to 12 systems and executed Mimikatz on 2 hosts, but the Overwatch alert enabled our incident response team to engage and prevent the next phase of the attack, so no ransomware was ever deployed. Good communications with the victim company and a quick response by all partners averted a major crisis. That's the power of we. In another recent engagement, our incident response team was brought in to investigate suspicious admin activity for a service provider serving many sensitive commercial organizations in the US and around the world. Through the course of the investigation, as many as 15 people at a time were working in concert across 2 separate work streams, team host analysis and team cloud analysis. It turns out the adversary was not only conducting operations against the environment while our team was doing their response in 2021, but through the course of the investigation, the teams were able to uncover the same threat actor activity as far back as 2019, all unbeknownst to the victim. This case had all the makings of a tragedy for the victim and their customers. Cloud penetration, Active Directory abuse, unauthorized certifications, directory syncing, browser cookie stealing, and much more. It was the epitome of a large-scale, state-sponsored espionage campaign. This was a hard-fought crusade, but we were able to deliver an impactful service, helping our client overcome a potentially devastating incident and getting back to normal operations. We did this through effective communication, expertise, and teamwork, all with a sense of urgency. Again, the power of we. As is typical recently, we had yet another major global financial services organization reach out because they were hit by ransomware. Our incident response and endpoint recovery services teams were brought in to conduct the investigation and to assist the victim with recovery. They were bleeding out, unable to support any of their business functions. We were singularly focused on helping the client uncover the entry points of the adversary, determine the tactics and techniques of the attack, and finally to assist in the recovery operations to get them back online and operation as soon as possible. At the client's request, we coordinated with law enforcement and we discovered the credentials for the data exfiltration upload to the third-party cloud provider the adversary was using, which allowed us to bring their activity to light with many other victim organizations. The power of we. And just 8 weeks ago, leading into the US holiday weekend, our Fal.Con Overwatch team identified ransomware activity at multiple companies stemming from the compromise of Kaseya, an IT and solutions provider. Based on CrowdStrike Falcon X threat intelligence telemetry and available open source reporting, Pinchy Spider or an affiliate likely compromised Kaseya's virtual systems administrator software to facilitate the distribution of our evil ransomware. Fal.Con Overwatch was able to observe Kaseya's monitor service execute a series of commands to introduce a delay to synchronize the attack. They saw them write and encode file to disk, disable security controls, decode a payload, and ultimately execute the REvil ransomware. Overwatch quickly mobilized a war room to coordinate and ensure awareness across various teams. They sent alerts to our customers who were impacted by the hands-on activity and coordinated with our MDR team, Fal.Con Complete, to contain and remediate the threat for our customers. Impacted customers who had retainers with our professional services team were put on an expedited path to not only remediate, but to analyze the full scope of the breach in their environment. Additionally, Fal.Con Overwatch coordinated internally with our product security research team to deploy additional preventions and detections to stop execution of this activity higher in the kill chain. To proactively support our customers who are running vulnerable Kaseya software in their environments, our CrowdStrike support and Spotlight teams coordinated to develop queries to detect vulnerable versions of software. They built UI dashboards to track them, and they notified all vulnerable customers. Finally, Overwatch coordinated with CrowdStrike's Falcon X Intel team to provide detailed analysis of the events for external dissemination to help the broader information security practitioners in protecting their organizations. These many attacks, including the prolific ransomware actors, have escalated the tempo of their operations, emphasizing the importance of identifying and blocking these operators in the seconds and minutes leading to a breach attempt. CrowdStrike's multi-team internal coordination, external partnerships, and close synchronization with victims ensured protection and security of our clients. The power of we. We are much more powerful and resilient together than we are apart, and these examples highlight that. And we need to carry that philosophy going forward because the adversaries are relentless. From July 2020 through the end of June 2021, our teams, intelligence, incident responders, and threat hunters have tracked the following. A 60% increase in interactive, hands-on intrusion activity spanning all industry verticals and geographic regions. We saw adversaries escalating their movement well beyond malware, augmenting the living off the land techniques that are quite difficult for legacy technologies to identify. We saw e-crime continuing to dominate the threat landscape, accounting for 75% of interactive intrusion activity, and e-crime adversaries moving with increased speed. We're talking lateral movement within a victim environment in an average of an hour and 32 minutes. We saw China, North Korea, and Iran remain the most active state-sponsored groups and only getting more aggressive. And we saw a surge in interactive, targeted intrusion activity and specific campaigns against the telecommunications industry. And we identified and stopped a potential 65,000 intrusions. That's one disrupted intrusion every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, because of the power of we. These aren't just unsupported statistics or notional attacks. These are actual human beings operating within groups, behind the keyboard, creating and executing disruptive and destructive attacks on commercial and global infrastructure. It's the power of them versus the power of we. And we need to be faster, we need to be stronger, we need to be more accurate, and we need to be more alert to their activities. I often tell my team here, step into the breach. It's an old SWAT team adage that means running through the dislodged door or window or across an open area without cover to rescue a victim, to secure a dangerous situation, or to neutralize a threat. As you enter the breach, you're in the most perilous predicament, often not knowing exactly what you're about to encounter on the other side. It's not ideal, but being prepared enables you to successfully resolve the situation. In the cyber realm, it carries a similar connotation. As we investigate a breach, we often don't know what we'll encounter. We know there's always going to be a victim, and they're suffering and they're in crisis. And our job is to uncover, disrupt, and neutralize the bad actors before they achieve cataclysmic results. Being in that situation is not ideal for anyone, but we do it because we believe in our mission. CrowdStrike was built for this fight. We eat, sleep, and breathe hunting adversaries, and we've built tools powered by passion and precision to prevent, protect, and preserve. We walk headlong into the danger when others won't or can't because they don't have the capabilities or the capacity to do so. And we do it together with our partners and with our customers because the capabilities of our adversaries require that we marshal all our available resources. We must rise to the occasion and bring our A game, united in common cause against our adversaries. I challenge you to ask yourself, who do I want in this fight with me? To step into the breach with us and embrace the power of we.
Thank you, Shawn. Those are some incredible customer stories and are a great example of the power of we. Now we'll stay in DC to hear the latest on the e-crime index. Please welcome Adam Meyers, CrowdStrike's Senior Vice President of Intelligence.
Hi, I'm Adam Meyers, and I run intelligence here at CrowdStrike. I've been at CrowdStrike for over 10 years now. And what I'm here to talk to you about today is what we call the e-crime index. And this is something that we created to help track what's going on in the underground economy, as it were. The e-crime index really began with us thinking about how can we help customers understand what's going on in the world and what do we think is going to happen next. And so we looked back at kind of classic economic theory. For those of you that are familiar with Adam Smith, in 1776, he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And in this, he referenced something that he called the invisible hand, which is used to describe the behavior of people acting in their own self-interest and how that drives macro themes. It's worth noting that this isn't universally accepted. There's certainly been contrarian views to this. Karl Marx, for example, felt that the individual was doing these things because the state didn't meet their needs. Kind of leveraging what we've learned from classic economic theory, let's take a little bit of a step forward and think about what happened in the late 1800s. Charles Dow began computing indexes, the first one being the Dow Jones Transportation Index, and later the Dow Jones Industrial Index. The original Dow Jones Index contained various products that people were using at the time, things like food, tobacco, gas, chemicals, leather, rubber, things that drove the economy. And it's changed over time as technologies changed, people's needs and demands changed. It's been used to represent the overall economic health and really how people feel about the economy. In the 1940s, for example, the Dow climbed as the world came to peace following World War II. In the 1970s, as energy crisis, inflation, unemployment became dominant economic concerns, the Dow Jones Industrial Average shed almost half of its value. In 2008, the financial crisis occurred, and the Dow Jones hit a 12-year low as a result of what was going on with the global economy. And as the world came to grips with the global pandemic in 2020, the DJI first crashed. And it quickly recovered as people realized that the global economy could and would recover. And so we looked at how the Dow Jones Index works. We looked at how the broader economy works. We looked at some of the things that drive that economy, things like the global supply chain. And in the last year, we've certainly seen plenty of issues with the cyber supply chain. The SolarWinds incident was really a watershed event that brought people's attention to the fact that things could impact them way up the supply chain and it would have negative consequences. The Kaseya ransomware incident, again, deployed ransomware through a supply chain attack, and that was the first time people realized that criminal actors, not just nation states, would be able to leverage the supply chain against them. And as a result, we started taking a look at the different threat actors and really the underground economy that they represent. At CrowdStrike, we think about threat actors as nation state, criminal, hacktivist, and as we dove deeper into the criminal space, we realized that it's really not just criminal actors operating in their own self-interest and invisible hand, but they all work together. It's the underground economy, if you will. And as we started thinking about the underground economy, what we realized is that it's made up of a couple of different things. For example, services. Over the last year, we've talked very extensively to customers about access brokers. Access brokers leverage exploits that they can use to hack into lots of different organizations. And they take these accesses and sell them to ransomware actors or anybody, really the highest bidder, that wants to conduct these operations or further operations using that initial access. Services include ransomware as a service. It includes cryptors and builders and lots of different things that enable future operations. Distribution is the second thing that we looked at. Distribution involves spam and exploit kits, and how do you get the threat onto the system to start with? Pay-per-install is another good example of this. And then finally, monetization. Criminal actors often leverage monetization services to help them in making money and to really leverage the things that they've stolen or that they've gotten access to. And in the case of ransomware, for example, monetization would include things like negotiation services and things that will help them quickly monetize and receive payment for the ransom attacks that they've conducted. And as we thought about these different aspects of the underground economy, it occurred to us that we could potentially model this with an index of our own, what we call the E-Crime Index or the ECX. With the E-Crime Index, we take different observables from the underground economy, things like number of ransomware incidents or the average ransom demand. We look at the rate that they're charging for access to an organization through a compromise or stolen credential costs. There's lots of different things, in fact, over 30 that we track today that are computed in this E-Crime Index. And as we think about the E-Crime Index and we look at what's occurred over the last year, some interesting patterns have emerged. The first one, shortly after we launched the E-Crime Index, we observed that on Black Friday and Cyber Monday, there was a peak. This is expected. For the last 10 years, we've warned customers every November as we lead into the holiday season and people are engaged in more online shopping and using their credit cards online, that there's likely going to be an increase in e-crime activity And the e-crime index actually reflected that in the last year. As we move forward to Christmas, we see that around Christmas, there's a dip in the e-crime index. Threat actors are taking time off. They're spending time with their families. They're doing all the things that we're doing during that same time period. And as a result, the e-crime index starts to go down. In the beginning of the year, we see an uptick in activity. This really overlapped very nicely with Microsoft on Patch Tuesday releasing 56 vulnerabilities, that 11 of which were critical. Vulnerabilities and exploits that leverage those vulnerabilities are the currency of the underground economy. They use these to get in, they use this to get access to different systems. So when 11 critical exploits become available or known, the criminals are quick to capitalize on that and use that to increase the pace of their operations, which resulted in another uptick in the e-crime index. In March, mass exploitation of Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities at the hands of Chinese actors associated with the People's Republic of China were very prevalent. We see massive exploitation across many different systems, targeting Exchange all over the world. And in this mass exploitation, the Chinese threat actors deployed web shells that they left on these systems for later access. They would come back and use that presumably for further espionage operations. But we found that e-criminals realized that they could also repurpose these web shells to deploy things like ransomware. And the exploits became more widely known, and those threat actors begin to work on developing their own versions of these exploits to conduct operations against Exchange servers. A few weeks later, we see another peak. And this really represented market drivers. We see an increase in threat actors' operations, the pace of big game hunting operations. We see higher ransom demands occurring, and as a result, we see the e-crime index coming to yet another high. In fact, one of the highest highs that we've seen over the last year. Now, this begins to drop off in May when we learn about the Colonial Pipeline attack. The Colonial Pipeline attack was really a watershed event, I think, because for the first time, there was actually a disruption that impacted consumers. People couldn't get fuel on the East Coast of the United States. And coming off of a global pandemic, when supply chains have been disrupted, people see that fuel becomes hard to come by, and they start stocking up, further exasperating this issue. But as a result of the Colonial Pipeline incident, the US government begins to make commentary on this. We start seeing ransomware becoming something that people are talking about as something that needs to be addressed. Many of the underground forums begin deplatforming these ransomware actors. The ransomware actors were told that they weren't allowed to operate on underground forums, where they had been recruiting people that would use their ransomware for operations, then enable them to start to generate more revenue. And so we start to see the e-crime index going down. But a month later, people have kind of forgotten a little bit about this. The JBS attack occurs, and in this incident, the Department of Justice has come out and said that they will begin to treat ransomware investigations like terrorism investigations. And this created a lot of consternation for ransomware actors. They begin to lay low even more. Many more of them are deplatformed. They begin to react to this. Pinchy Spider, one of the actors that we've been tracking for quite some time as a ransomware as a service, announces that they will take all constraints off of their affiliates and that they can hack any US entity they want. And we see a spike occur again. And at the end of this spike is the Kaseya incident. And when Kaseya occurs, this is really kind of the last straw in the ransomware discussion from a US government perspective. We start to see much more attention being paid, and more of these ransomware groups kind of take a pause. They cool off and wait for the heat to die down. And in recent weeks, we've seen that this is trending back upwards. We've seen Pinchy Spider suddenly came back online in September, and we're continuing to track these trends and patterns to see how these threats are continuing to evolve. And so, as I conclude here, I'd like to invite everybody to join us and continue looking at the e-crime index, which is available on the Adversary Universe, and help take a look and understand what are we seeing and what do we think is going to happen next, because e-crime is not going away. As long as there's money to be made, these ransomware actors will continue to operate, and if one goes away, new ones will emerge to take their place. Thank you.
Adam, that was great. Thank you. Now please welcome our closer, CrowdStrike Chief Product Officer Amol Kulkarni, for a deep dive into some of our new releases this year. Take it away, Amol.
On behalf of our 1,000+ engineers and product professionals across the globe, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Product and Innovation session at Fal.Con 2021. I'm super excited to talk to you about 5 new releases today. But before I do that, let's take a look at some of the products and features we've shipped in what has been an unparalleled year of customer-focused innovation at CrowdStrike. From custom dashboards to Linux real-time response, to a new module in Falcon Horizon that gives cloud security posture management, to the macOS user mode sensor that aligns with Apple's new security framework, to Falcon Container Sensor protecting managed container environments, to 2 new modules in Falcon Zero Trust and Falcon Forensics, notification workflows, that is the first iteration of our workflow technology, an industry first in cloud control plane IOAs, another new module in Falcon X Recon, another industry first in multi-cloud identity coverage as part of Horizon, the message center that's built in to the Falcon console for Falcon Complete, and a whole new evaluation engine and broad expanded coverage for Spotlight. And finally, Falcon Fusion. So let's talk more about Falcon Fusion. One of the pain points we repeatedly hear from our customers is the rigidity of their security stack. Legacy and even modern security solutions don't fit real-world problems and the real-world workflows that you have. You either cannot customize them or cannot build policies intuitively, or you have too much customization that is required, which creates unwanted complexity. In a recent survey that we did, 71% of respondents cited integration complexity within their security stack as a significant inhibitor. 92% reported operational challenges with security solutions, and 80% claimed alert fatigue is an issue within their organization. One of the solutions recommended for this is to use a SOAR platform. But if you look at today's external SOAR platforms, they fundamentally lack the context that's required to solve these challenges. And that's where we believe Falcon Fusion can be a true game changer. Falcon Fusion is a SOAR framework that's natively built into the Falcon platform, and it's available to all Falcon customers at no additional cost. This deep integration into the platform provides deep contextual insight that helps improve the efficiency of SOC teams and reduces the mean time to remediate threats. Fusion also integrates deeply with real-time response to provide powerful incident response capabilities across the entire Falcon platform. But most importantly, Fusion allows you to encode your business logic via a simple no-code drag-and-drop experience that results in Falcon Fusion making the Falcon platform work for you, not the other way around. And it's available now as part of the Falcon platform. Let's take a quick look at this exciting platform capability.
Falcon Fusion is a unified and extensible SOAR framework purpose-built on the CrowdStrike Falcon platform to orchestrate and automate any complex workflow, helping you streamline and simplify your IT and security operations. Let's look at an example of how we can leverage Falcon Fusion with the ServiceNow app for ticket creation, showcasing the power of our partner ecosystem. Here you are looking at the workflow builder as part of the Falcon console. We are looking at a workflow that has been built using a combination of triggers, conditions, and actions, where the actions use our partner apps like VirusTotal and ServiceNow to help with additional investigations and incident creation. The automated workflow that is shown here starts with a detection, filters for high severity, looks against the file hash for VirusTotal, and finally creates an incident within ServiceNow. On the left side of the console, you can see we have access to configure attributes such as the assigned user, assigned group, category, a short description, as well as attributes from the event that we want to include in the ticket. Now let's look at the execution of this built workflow, and you can quickly see that the execution has been completed successfully. At the end of the workflow action, the ServiceNow API call was successful, and as a result, a new incident has been created. Let's hop to ServiceNow to check the incident within the management console, including the same configured attributes like the category, the description we defined, and all of the attributes from the initial event, including the VirusTotal activity preceding this event creation for the hash file lookup. With Falcon Fusion, we can create any number of new workflows easily, with complex branching and sequencing logic, employing no-code workflow builder to help automate response capabilities based on threat detections and incidents, resulting in the improved efficiency and efficacy of security and IT teams.
So solving these pain points around complexity and the benefits of Falcon Fusion also play a key role in our next big product announcement, Falcon XDR. In the enterprise, every few years, a new technology comes along. But unlike consumer, enterprise technology almost never become obsolete. The cloud did not kill data centers and on-prem workloads. Mobile did not kill the desktop. So every new innovation that comes in actually ends up adding to the complexity and increases the surface area that enterprise IT has to manage and secure. And we all know our teams aren't scaling at the same pace, which means all too often this falls on you to manage, you to scale yourself, to scramble, to manage this additional attack surface. So what we need is a security solution that integrates the security stack across all of these technologies into a single pane of glass, enabling you to manage security across your enterprise. But we have to do it without adding complexity. And that's exactly what we are doing with Falcon XDR. Unfortunately, what some call XDR in the industry today is actually adding to your problems, because they're simply creating a big haystack, an even larger haystack, and asking you to hunt for that needle of malicious activity. So let's geek out for a minute, see how we are building Falcon XDR. The most important ingredient for XDR is the security cloud. Today, we track smart filtered endpoint activity, users and identities, and assets and configurations across a variety of workloads in the CrowdStrike Security Cloud, processing over 1 trillion events a day. And now we are expanding our security cloud by adding smart filtered third-party data and detections from domains like network security, email security, cloud, IaaS and PaaS, and SaaS and CASB. For the first time in the industry, this will give you a comprehensive picture of your entire estate in one place. And then we apply our unique differentiators that you love, IOAs and machine learning, to give you real-time detections and prevention across your estate. And lastly, we leverage the power of Falcon Fusion to provide automated response customized to your workflow. This is Falcon XDR. Simply put, Falcon XDR enriches EDR data with telemetry from targeted vendor-specific security data, provides real-time threat detection, prevention, and hunting across all domains, and it provides proactive automated response through Falcon Fusion. Falcon XDR is available in December of this year. Here is a sneak peek.
XDR will extend the reach of the Falcon platform to power threat detection, hunting, and response across multiple technologies and domains. XDR detections can stop breaches that may not be detected through a single data source. Let's look at an example of an XDR detection that correlates a suspicious AWS login with a suspicious email event to detect and stop a breach. We'll start with the Falcon XDR Graph View, a powerful tool that allows you to immediately visualize the detection and perform deeper investigation. Here we see a cloud storage login event and an email security event connected to the same user identity. A closer look at the cloud security event shows an AWS login with valid user credentials from a new IP not previously associated with that user. Looking at the email event, we can see that prior to the suspicious login, the user clicked on a URL in an email that was later flagged as suspicious by their email security provider. The URL points to a spoofed AWS login page. We now see the full story. The user clicked on a malicious link in a spear phishing message and entered their credentials, which were then stolen by the adversary and used to log into AWS. We can take immediate action from the Falcon console by disabling this IAM user's access or forcing a reset of their credentials. XDR will integrate with Falcon Fusion so we can create a new workflow to automate this response to similar detections in the future.
Cloud is on the top of our mind today. And cloud security, unfortunately, is a tangled web. Because today's cloud runs on a shared security model, one where the cloud provider and you, the customer, share the threat surface and the responsibility to stop breaches. And you have to do this across multiple clouds, which makes the story even more fragmented. That means real cloud security status is often opaque. In fact, a recent HashiCorp survey found that security is one of the biggest blockers for digital transformation and the cloud migration, which is so critical right now. We need to solve this by stopping breaches in the cloud. So how do we do that? We apply the same philosophy that we applied to endpoint security by adding comprehensive visibility at DevOps velocity, right from the build time to the runtime. In the cloud world, applications change very, very frequently, which means the threat surface is also constantly changing. Any effective solution has to keep up with those changes so as to eliminate those blind spots that we know that adversary can and will take advantage of. The complexity of hybrid cloud environments makes misconfigurations far too common. Finding those indicators of misconfigurations, or IOMs as we call them, early and guiding remediation is critical to reducing that attack surface. But proper configuration is the min bar. It's not sufficient to stop the breaches because adversaries will leverage a variety of runtime attacks using legitimate tools to achieve their goals. So I think of IOMs as similar to legacy AV in the endpoint world. And hence what we did is we added cloud IOAs, applying our behavior, our expertise in behavioral detection to cloud security. Falcon Cloud Security is the first platform to detect indicators of attack on that cloud control plane. And we are the only platform that's able to correlate insights from the runtime with the control plane IOAs to give you a full picture of the cause and the effect of runtime behavior and control plane. Last but not the least, we are giving you tools like container image assessment and Kubernetes security to enable you to integrate security in your DevOps workflows. And for the first time, implement DevSecOps at scale. And all of this is available now. At CrowdStrike, we understand the adversary will up their game as those easy problems of misconfigurations reduce. And having a platform ready to tackle that is the only way to stop breaches in the cloud now and in the future. Let's take a look at Falcon Cloud Security in action.
With CrowdStrike, you get one unified platform to secure your cloud from build to runtime. As security team responsibility shifts towards the left, CrowdStrike image assessment enables you to find vulnerabilities and detections associated with the image before it's used. At runtime, using a dedicated container dashboard, you can quickly identify detections associated with containers. You can view complete context for detections and the metadata associated with the container in a single pane of glass to quickly triage the incident. The sensor also captures cloud metadata, such as account information, so that you can seamlessly correlate runtime detections with cloud events collected by Falcon Horizon. Falcon Horizon provides advanced cloud security posture management that goes beyond misconfigurations and compliance to identify critical behavioral indicators of attack in the cloud. For example, an IOA indicated that an S3 bucket is publicly exposed. This is a serious event that could indicate a data exfiltration attack. The IOA is presented in a timeline view that shows the steps carried out by the adversary. You can see the triggering event in red, in which the S3 bucket is publicly exposed. Once you have resolved the IOA, you may want to check that other critical cloud resources, such as IAM users, are configured in accordance with the baseline security policies.
So one of the challenges we have is with file integrity monitoring. We need it, but no one really says, I love my FIM. And I'm sure this resonates with you. That's because security teams are constantly surprised by hidden vulnerabilities not caught by their FIM. And as attack surfaces continue to evolve with the increasing complexity, the existing FIM solutions really cannot keep up. But even worse, these existing solutions are brittle. The frequent software updates that we have to keep deploying create lots of false positives and put a heavy burden on the SOC. Today, I'm excited to introduce Fal.Con FileVantage. Fal.Con FileVantage is a different kind of FIM. It uses the same Fal.Con sensor you love so that there are no additional agents to deploy. Fal.Con platforms collect once, use multiple times approach ensures low overhead on your systems. FileVantage enables SOC teams to track changes at a granular level to files and configurations that they are interested in, the ones that are critical to the business. But it does this without drowning the teams into a deluge of alerts by leveraging the insights that are offered by the security cloud. And it comes with all of those enterprise maturity features that the Fal.Con platform offers and that you love and use every single day. With FileVantage, better visibility into your enterprise means no surprises. And I'm happy to announce it's available next month. Now let's talk about Spotlight. Today, security and IT teams are constantly bombarded with vulnerabilities found for operating systems and for applications. OS and app vendors are continuing to issue hundreds of patches every month. And then there are workarounds and configuration changes to mitigate against vulnerabilities where patching is not an option. This huge number of patches is honestly impossible for anyone to keep up with. The result is Microsoft Patch Tuesday has become more like zero-day Tuesday now, as attackers quickly reverse the patches and create exploits targeting the vulnerabilities, because they know very well you're not going to be able to patch your estate right away as soon as the patches come out. And the challenge here is, if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. So what we need to do, we need a way to intelligently prioritize which vulnerabilities need to be patched. Today, I'm excited to announce Expert AI, a new exploitability prediction rating that will help you focus on the vulnerabilities that have the highest probability of exploitation. Spotlight will also provide specific remediation steps that you can take to mitigate these top priority vulnerabilities. And it will soon enable full orchestration of your remediation workflow through Fal.Con Fusion. Let's take a deeper look at how Expert AI works. The critical ingredient for the rating is CrowdStrike's industry-leading exploit and threat intelligence, as well as the insights that Spotlight has into a customer's environment. These inputs are analyzed continuously by AI models to generate a dynamic rating. This dynamism is very important because a vulnerability may be actively exploited in the wild one day and be relegated to the background the next day. In addition, we'll provide a historical view of the rating, which will enable SOC teams to scope forensic investigations to time windows where the rating was the highest. And Expert AI is obviously not a simple formula. So Spotlight will provide insight into the AI model by noting key indicators that influence the rating. These Spotlight enhancements will enable you to focus on the right vulnerabilities to mitigate and remedy them quickly. Expert AI is available beginning October 2021. We are incredibly excited to bring these new offerings to market, from Fal.Con Fusion to XDR to cloud security to FileVantage to Expert AI. And these are just some of the top highlights. We are continuing to innovate relentlessly across the entire platform, deepening and broadening it every single day. And we are making it far easier for customers and partners to build on this foundation. Just to put the incredible velocity in perspective, we are now having over 500 deployments every single week across all of the cloud environments, and over 100 new major releases every single year. And we are just getting started. We will keep innovating relentlessly to keep the good guys 2 steps ahead of the bad guys, to keep stopping breaches. I hope this gave you a good glimpse into what we have coming to the Fal.Con platform this year. And I encourage you to take part in all of the learning sessions that we have lined up to dive deeper into these new features and products. Thank you very much.
皆様、ファルコンの基調講演後半の部、いかがだったでしょうか。これではですね、私のセッションでは、日本語による後半のセッションの解説をしていきたいというふうに思っております。後半のセッションでは、主に新しく追加された5つの機能、そして現状を取り巻くサイバー脅威の状況といったものの解説が紹介されていましたけれども、私の方からはこの5つの新しいリリースに関して、主に紹介させていただきたいというふうに思っております。より詳細に関しては、この後のラーニングセッション等でもですね、触れてまいりますので、そちらをご参加いただく、もしくは弊社にお問い合わせいただくという形で進めさせていただきたいと思います。まず一つ目がFal.Con Fusionですね。こちらオートメーションの機能になりますが、こちらのご説明をさせていただきました。そして XDR ですね。通常の我々の EDR だけではなくて、XDR という新しい考え方、そしてただ単にこれは拡張だけではないですよというお話をさせていただいています。そして、クラウドにおけるセキュリティといったものも、やっぱりクラウドネイティブのアプリケーションといったものに注目をして、どのように守っていけばいいのかというお話をさせていただきました。そして、これは非常に毛色が変わってますけれども、ファイルインテグリティモニタリング、ファイルの精神性をですね、チェックするというソリューションですが、このあたりもやはりセキュリティを全体像として捉えていく上では必要なソリューションということで投入をさせていただいています。そして、Fal.Con Spotlight、こちらは脆弱性管理のソリューションなんですけれども、こちらの機能拡張をさせていただきましたよというお話をさせていただいております。それでは簡単ですけれども、これら5つについてご紹介させていただきます。まずFal.Con Fusionですけれども、これはもう今日のセッションを通じて非常に多く語られていた内容になっておりますけれども、セキュリティのオーケストレーション&オートメーションを実現するプラットフォームになります。そして、これはFal.Conプラットフォームに統合されておりまして、これまでのこのセキュリティの運用管理といったもの、そして効率化といったものに対する課題を解決する、一つの方法として、皆様に検討していただく価値のあるソリューションとして、提供させていただいております。そしてこれはプラットフォームに統合されておりますので、Fal.Conのすべてのお客様が追加費用なしで利用いただけるというところが一つご利用いただきやすい環境のポイントになっております。そしてですね、このFal.Con Fusionなんですけれども、やはりこのカスタマイズですね。やはり硬直化された非常にこの運用といったものを定型化をがっちり固めてしまうとなかなか難しいんですけれども、それを非常にカスタマイズしやすい。そして状況としてどのようなことが行われているのかというのの可視性ですね。そしてインシデント対応を効率化していく。結果、修正、脅威に対する対応の平均時間が短縮され、業務効率が向上していくという流れになってくるわけです。こちらのFal.Con Fusionに関しましては、すでにお客様がご利用いただける環境となっておりますので、ぜひご活用をご検討ください。2つ目が XDR ということですね。XDR の X っていうのは、これExtended の拡張という形なんですけれども、セキュリティで見なければいけないポイントといったものが、やはり日々拡大してきていると。しかしながら拡大すればするほど複雑になってくるわけです。そういった複雑な、もう膨大な情報の中から本当に必要な対策っていうのは何なんだろうというところを拾い出すというのが非常に至難の技なんですが、これをシステムとして、最大限テクノロジーを活用して効率化を図っていくというのが、この XDR のポイントになっています。 様々な XDR と呼ばれているものが市場にございますけれども、我々はその単純に CM ツールの拡大版が XDR だとか EDR の拡大版が XDR だというふうには考えていません。先ほど申しました通り、もう膨大な情報の中からそれをシステムとしてテクノロジーで最大限本当に必要なものだけを拾い出し、そしてそれを自動化して対応していく、そういったテクノロジーを最大限生かした総合的な対応といったものがこの XDR だというふうに考えています。つまり私どものセキュリティクラウドですね、このインフラストラクチャーにネットワーク、そして E メール、様々なクラウド、そして SaaS や CASB といった我々だけではない様々なペリメーターからの共有情報といったものを収集していく。それのインフラとしてのヒュミオですね。ヒュミオというログマネジメントのソリューションにそこを収集をして、そしてリアルタイムで解析をしていく。そして、これが拡張しているので X の部分ですけれども、そしてディテクション、検知の部分は我々非常に強みのある EDR をベースにして、さらにここにあるようなパートナーからのデータを収集して精度を上げていく。そして R、レスポンスの部分ですけれども、この部分ですが、やはりですね、どんどん攻撃の激化、そして侵入からラテラルムーブメントまでの時間が短くなっている。なので、ここのところはなるべく極力自動化し、そして効率性を上げて迅速に対応していくのが求められています。ですので、今後には自動化ですね、Fal.Conフュージョンのテクノロジーを当てていくということで、この XDR といったものを提供していこうという、単純にこれまでの機能を拡張しましたよというだけではないんですね。本質的にこのディテクションのレスポンスの考え方といったものを変えていくというのがこの XDR になります。この Fal.Con XDR ですが、今年の12月に提供を開始する予定となっておりますので、ご期待ください。そして、クラウドセキュリティですね。こちらもですね、私ども、様々なクラウドセキュリティに対するソリューションといったものは提供しておりますが、課題として、その責任共有モデルという形で、アプリケーションレイヤーは当然お客様守らなきゃいけない。さらには複数のクラウド間でのセキュリティ保護というのが分断されている、断片化されているというので、可視性が低くなっているよねと、様々な問題が我々認識しております。そして、やはりこのクラウドネイティブで、そのアプリケーションといったものを活用していく上でのこの DevOps といった一つの流れですね。当然このアプリケーションの開発におけるその開発室からクラウドにポストするまでの間に迅速な環境のアプリケーションの理解とそこに対するどのような脅威があるのかというのを判定する必要があります。そのようなことを実装するために、私どもクラウドアプリケーションに対するセキュリティとして、この DevSecOps のアプローチとして、ループを考えています。例えば、ハイブリッドクラウドの可視性、そして、IOM ですね、ミスコンフィグレーション。そして IOA という攻撃の兆候といったものを組み合わせることで、より精度の高い、本当に対処すべきものは何なのかというのを導き出したり、あとはそれらをですね、一つのクラウドコントロールプレーンの攻撃の兆候といったものを合わせてですね、一つの相関分析できる唯一のプラットフォームとして我々提供しております。そしてこの次になりますけれども、このイメージですね、コンテナイメージの評価と Kubernetes のセキュリティによって、セキュリティを DevOps ワークフローに統合して、DevSecOps といったものをですね、大規模に展開できる、実装できると。こういう環境をですね、私どものソリューションでは、実現を目指しておるとということで、このあたり、全体的なですね、DevSecOps をお考えのお客様は、このあたりをですね、一つ検討いただければなというふうに思っております。このクラウドセキュリティに関しては、もう機能は提供しておりますので、より詳細な情報はですね、また別途違うセッション等でもご紹介しておりますので、ご覧ください。次に、ファイルインテグリティモニタリングですね。ファイルの正常性を確認するためのソリューションでございますけれども、 これはこれまでやはりなかなか管理が大変だと、運用が大変だということで、なかなかですね、これをいの一番にやるという形ではなくて、後手後手になっていたソリューションにはなるんですが、こちらの方、現状の課題といったものがあります。そういったものをですね、解決することで、よりこの FIM といったものをお客様に提供しやすい、そういったものをですね、我々提供しようというふうに考えております。このブランドとしてはですね、Fal.Con ファイルバンテージという形で提供させていただくものになるんですが、当然、これは通常の Fal.Con プラットフォームにおける他のソリューションと同様にですね、シングルエージェントで低いオーバーヘッドですね、端末に負荷がかからず、そしてファイル構成とか変更に対するですね、きめ細かい情報といったものを収集し、それを可視化していくということを実現するソリューションとなっておりますので、皆様こちらもご期待いただければなというふうに思っております。こちらは11月ですね、に提供を開始を予定しております。そして最後になりますけれども、Fal.Conスポットライトになります。こちらは脆弱性管理のソリューションとして、これまでも多くのお客様にお使いいただいておりますけれども、やはりですね、パッチがリリースされてから攻撃が、そのパッチに対する、脆弱性に対する攻撃が始まるまでの期間というのがもう0デーのように短くなってきているというので、やはりパッチをいかに優先順位をつけて確実に当てていくのかというのが非常に重要なポイントになってきていますよということですね。で、その優先順位をつけるにあたってどのように判定するのかというので、様々な判定基準があります。外での脅威の状況とか、どのような悪用のされ方があるというので、様々なレーティングがあるんですけれども、ここにですね、私どもエクスパート AI という新しい脅威判定の人工知能の仕組みをですね、追加してまいります。これによりですね、優先順位のより確実なスコアリング、そして推奨される修復の方法、そして我々のオーケストレーションツールであるフュージョンとの連携といったものをこれに実現していくというのが、より効率的な脆弱性管理のあり方だろうということで、こちらの方はですね、今年の12月にリリースを予定しております。以上、私どもですね、Fal.Conプラットフォーム上での5つのソリューションの強化といったものを発表させていただきましたが、日々ですね、それ以外の機能においても、毎日のようにですね、機能強化といったものを提供しております。年間100を超えるですね、新しい機能の追加といったものを行っておりますので、こういった機能を絶え間なくやっていくことで、現状様々なスレッドアクター、脅威の攻撃者からのそれを先を行くセキュリティ対策といったものを我々提供してまいりますので、よりこのあたりご理解いただくためには今後のラーニングセッションといったものもご参加いただければなと思います。以上、第2部の解説となります。ご清聴ありがとうございました。